And if I were to tell you that behind the greatest basketball career in history lies a secret never before revealed, that someone very close to Michael Jordan carried a devastating burden for 46 years in absolute silence. Imagine harboring such profound knowledge about a beloved individual, a secret that consumed your soul for decades. What would you do if a youthful decision had irrevocably altered someone's destiny? Today, for the first time in nearly half a century, this secret will be unveiled live. A confession that could reshape everything you believe about determination, success, and brotherly love. But should certain truths remain buried? Is Michael Jordan prepared to hear what he never imagined? Prepared to discover that not all inspiration springs from where we expect. The question is, can you bear the truth behind the myth? The biting Chicago chill pierced the ESPN radio studio windows, creating a subtle frost on the glass separating the main booth from the control room. It was a typical January morning in the Windy City, with the thermometer hovering at -10 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind howling fiercely enough to force pedestrians to hunch as they navigated the icy downtown streets. Inside the heated studio, Dan Patrick adjusted his headphones for the third time in 5 minutes. A nervous tick cultivated over his decades in sports radio. His azure eyes quickly scanned the scattered notes on the polished mahogany desk, each page meticulously organized with questions concerning the charity event that would be the focus of the morning's interview. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the distinct scent of new electronic equipment, a quintessential atmosphere of professional broadcasting studios. Dan, you need to understand that today might be different, Larry Jordan muttered to himself, his words barely audible as he watched the host through the glass partition. Seated in the brown leather chair across the desk, Larry Jordan appeared smaller than his 63 years suggested, as if the weight of decades carrying unspoken secrets had literally bowed his broad shoulders. His hands, still strong and calloused from years of manual labor in his youth, trembled slightly as he arranged the papers relating to the Jordan Family Foundation, brought for the interview. The conservatively cut, meticulously combed gray hair contrasted with the restless expression in his brown eyes, which seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. He wore a navy blazer over a flawlessly ironed white shirt, a wardrobe choice that mirrored his meticulous and respectful personality, traits honed since his childhood in the Jordan household in Wilmington, North Carolina. His breathing was slightly ragged, like someone poised to dive into deep and unfamiliar waters. Michael will never forgive me for this, Larry thought, closing his eyes for a fleeting moment. The red light in the control booth flickered on, signaling their live broadcast, and Dan Patrick immediately assumed his characteristic professional stance, leaning slightly toward the microphone suspended before him. His voice, honed by years of experience, took on that warm, engaging tone that had made him one of America's most respected sports broadcasters. The studio walls, adorned with autographed photographs of American sporting legends, seemed to silently witness yet another conversation destined to become a memorable moment in the program's history. The low hum of the equipment fans formed a barely perceptible soundtrack, while digital indicators blinked gently, recording every word that would be transmitted to millions of listeners across the nation. It was Monday morning, prime time for ESPN Radio's morning show, and Dan knew there was something special in the air that day. We're here with Larry Jordan, Michael Jordan's older brother, who's with us today to promote the Jordan Family Foundation charity event, Dan said, his voice echoing perfectly through the speakers. Larry, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Larry's response was accompanied by a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a polite but distant expression that Dan Patrick had learned to recognize over decades of interviewing sports personalities. The basketball legend's older brother settled into his chair, casually crossing his legs, yet his fingers continued to tap nervously on the folder of documents he had brought with him. The fluorescent studio lights cast gentle shadows across his face, highlighting the lines etched by a life lived perpetually in the shadow of another's greatness, yet with his own dignity and purpose. His words were carefully chosen, each syllable carrying the weight of decades of similar interviews, where he was always presented as the older brother who had inspired the greatest basketball player of all time. Thank you for having me, Dan, Larry replied, his voice slightly deeper than usual. It's always good to be here. Dan Patrick, a seasoned reader of nuances in his interviewees' expressions and tones, immediately sensed something different in Larry Jordan's demeanor that morning. Michael Jordan's brother Larry exhibited subtle, yet profound signs of underlying tension during the interview. Decades of covering major American sports had honed Dan Patrick's journalistic instincts, allowing him to detect a palpable unease absent from previous conversations. Larry's avoidance of direct eye contact, restless hand movements, and slightly deepened breathing all were indicators that this wouldn't be a typical interview about philanthropy and family events. Abandoning the prepared script concerning the Jordan Family Foundation, Dan instinctively shifted focus to the emerging dynamic, a silent anticipation filling the studio, as if the equipment itself held its breath. "Larry, you know our listeners adore hearing about the Jordan family," Dan began, leaning forward slightly. "Before we discuss the event, I have to ask, are you all right? You seem a bit pensive today." The ensuing silence felt like an eternity, though the studio's digital clock marked only 15 seconds. Larry lowered his gaze to his intertwined hands, knuckles noticeably white from the pressure, his breathing deepening, controlled, like someone poised to leap from a precipice. Portraits of past athletes on the studio walls seemed to observe him, smiling faces, mirroring the intimate stories shared within those very same confines. Dan remained motionless, his professional instincts urging him to let Larry find the right words to express whatever he struggled to articulate. The studio's barely audible air conditioning hummed, a backdrop to the unspoken anticipation of millions of listeners, subconsciously yearning for a revelation that would forever alter their perception of the Jordan family. "Dan, to be honest, there's something I've been carrying for a long time," Larry finally said, his voice slightly trembling. "Something about Michael, about our family, that I've never told anyone." The shift in the studio's atmosphere was palpable, instantaneous, as if the temperature itself had dropped several degrees. Dan Patrick, having conducted thousands of interviews throughout his career, instantly recognized he was about to witness something extraordinary. Years of experience had honed his ability to pinpoint those rare moments when a casual conversation transformed into a journalistic narrative, and all his professional instincts were now on high alert. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, maintaining direct eye contact with Larry as he rapidly processed the implications of what he had just heard. The program, which had begun as a routine promotional interview for a charity event, had just taken a completely unexpected turn. Dan's hands automatically reached for his pen, though he knew every word was being recorded, a habit developed over decades of taking notes during significant conversations. "Larry, what do you mean?" Dan asked, his voice carrying a blend of professional curiosity and genuine concern. Larry Jordan slowly raised his eyes, and Dan Patrick could see that they were moist, reflecting years of contained emotion. It was like observing a dam poised to break after decades of holding back a flood. The man who had always been known as the supportive and inspirational brother, the one who had shaped the competitive spirit of basketball's greatest legend, seemed to be struggling against inner forces he had held in check for nearly half a century. His hands, now separated, trembled on the table, and his posture had completely shifted from the reserved confidence he had displayed upon entering the studio to something far more vulnerable and human. The studio light seemed more intense now, creating a dramatic contrast between shadows and reflections on his face, as if he were being illuminated by a spotlight during an interrogation. The silence in the studio was broken only by the almost imperceptible sound of both men's controlled breaths. "Dan, there's something about Michael that I've never told anyone in 46 years, Larry said, his voice gaining strength as the words flowed. "Not even my parents, not even him. Something that completely altered the course of our family's destiny." The impact of those words in the studio was like a silent shockwave. Veteran journalist Dan Patrick, a seasoned hand in high-pressure situations, felt his heart quicken as he processed the enormity of the unfolding scene before him. In his 4 decades of experience, he'd witnessed confessions, revelations, and intimate moments from major sports figures, but rarely had anything carry the emotional weight of this moment. The ESPN radio studio, moments before just another routine workplace, had transformed into the backdrop of something potentially historic. The walls seemed to close in slightly, creating an almost confessional intimacy between the two men, while millions of unsuspecting listeners waited on the other side of the airwaves. Dan knew he was witnessing something that could redefine one of American sport's most cherished narratives, and the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders like never before. "Larry, do you want to talk about this?" Dan asked softly, his voice carrying decades of experience in navigating delicate situations. Larry Jordan's next words were imbued with such intense emotion that his voice trembled noticeably, as if each syllable was being wrenched from some deep place within his soul. He looked directly at Dan Patrick, and for the first time in the interview, he didn't avert his gaze. There was a liberating quality to his expression, as if he were about to shed a burden he had carried for nearly 5 decades. His trembling hands stilled and settled firmly on the table, a physical transformation mirroring an irreversible internal decision. The air in the studio felt denser now, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Larry took another deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was a steely resolve in his gaze, absent earlier. "For 46 years, everyone believed a version of our story," Larry said, his voice now firm and clear. "But the truth is far more complex than anyone could imagine." Dan Patrick felt the ESPN radio studio morph into something entirely different after Larry Jordan's explosive revelation. The air grew heavy, charged with the electricity of a confession that had lain buried for nearly half a century. His decades of covering America's greatest sports stories had honed his journalistic instincts, which immediately recognized the historical significance of the unfolding scene. Not just an interview, but a complete dismantling of one of the sport's most celebrated narratives. The studio walls, adorned with autographed photographs of basketball legends, seemed to silently observe as one such legend was about to have their story rewritten in a way no one could have foreseen. Dan adjusted in his leather chair, the weight of journalistic responsibility pressing down on him like never before, aware that every word uttered would be dissected and re-examined by generations of sports fans. "Larry, everyone knows you were a profound inspiration to Michael," Dan said, his voice carrying the respectful tone he always employed when discussing the Jordans, now tinged with a keen journalistic curiosity. "Despite not becoming a professional player, you're consistently cited as someone who instilled in him determination and a pursuit of excellence. Tell me how that came to be." Dan's question triggered a visible transformation in Larry Jordan that was almost terrifying in its intensity. The 63-year-old, moments before seeming to bear the weight of the world, now straightened in his chair as if an inner force had been unleashed after decades of restrained expression. His hands, which had trembled nervously throughout the interview's initial portion, now settled upon the table with a resolve that appeared to emanate from some deep, shadowed part of his soul. Larry closed his eyes for a moment that felt like an eternity, and when he opened them again, a confessional quality suffused his gaze, making Dan realize he was about to hear something that would irrevocably alter his understanding of the Jordan family. The studio's silence was broken only by the almost imperceptible sound of Larry's controlled breathing, as if preparing to plunge into dangerous, profound waters. "Dan, this is precisely the first part of the secret I need to reveal," Larry said, his voice gaining an intensity that sliced through the studio air like a razor. "Everyone assumes I inspired Michael by being a natural example of determination. But the truth was, I manipulated every situation to create that inspiration." Larry's words burst forth with the force of a confession, suppressed for a lifetime, and Dan Patrick felt his stomach contract, not with shock, but with the sudden realization that he was witnessing the controlled demolition of one of American sport's most cherished narratives. The word "manipulated" echoed through the studio like a funeral bell, carrying with it decades of inspirational tales about the Jordan brothers that might have been built on foundations entirely different from what the world believed. Dan could feel millions of listeners on the other side of the radio, unconsciously leaning closer to their sets, sensing through the sonic waves that something extraordinary was unfolding. His eyes remained fixed on Larry, while his mind rapidly processed the implications of what he had just heard. If Larry had deliberately manipulated situations to inspire Michael, then how much of Michael Jordan's legend was natural and how much was artificial? "Wait a minute, Larry," Dan interrupted, his voice carrying a blend of journalistic fascination and genuine disbelief. You're telling me you consciously manipulated situations to mold Michael's competitive character? How did that work in practice? Larry inhaled deeply, like a diver preparing to descend into the ocean's darkest depths, and Dan could see the man poised to reveal specific details he'd kept locked within his heart for nearly 5 decades. Larry's weathered face, etched with every line that told the story of a life lived carrying extraordinary secrets, intensified. His hands were now clasped over the table, not with nervousness, but with the resolute posture of someone who had finally found the courage to confront a truth they'd avoided for a lifetime. The flashback about to be shared seemed to materialize before his eyes, as if he could peer through the studio walls and travel back to those pivotal mornings that had irrevocably altered his family's destiny. It was 1979, Michael was 16 and I was 17, Larry began, his voice assuming a hypnotic narrative quality that transformed the studio into a time machine. Every morning, religiously, the two of us played one-on-one in the backyard of our Wallace Street house in Wilmington. The sun rose around 6:30 a.m. that time of year, and we were already out there in our worn-out Converse, ready for another battle. And every morning, I deliberately let Michael win. The silence that followed Larry's confession was so profound and laden with meaning that Dan Patrick could literally feel the weight of those words crashing down on the studio like an emotional avalanche. The image Larry had painted, two teenage brothers playing basketball in the backyard of a suburban home in Wilmington, North Carolina, was iconic in the Jordan mythology, celebrated in documentaries, books, and countless interviews as the cradle of Michael's legendary competitiveness. But now, knowing that Larry had deliberately lost those games, completely transformed the narrative, revealing a layer of psychological manipulation that was both poignant and unsettling. Dan felt his throat tighten as he processed the magnitude of what he was hearing. The possibility that the psychological foundation of the greatest individual career in basketball history had been built on manufactured victories by a brother who loved him too much to allow reality to crush the potential he saw in Michael. You let him win? Dan asked, his voice slightly wavering with disbelief. Why, Larry? Why would you do that? What was your thinking behind that decision? Larry's response was accompanied by an expression that blended profound fraternal love with something far darker and more complex. The guilt of someone who had assumed the role of psychological architect of another person's destiny. He leaned back slightly in his chair, as if the weight of the memory he was about to share was physical, something tangible that needed to be handled with extreme care lest it crumble under the emotional pressure. His words came slowly, each syllable laden with decades of meticulous observation, psychological analysis, and calculated manipulation that he had kept in absolute secrecy since adolescence. The studio air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the revelation being broadcast to millions, and Dan could feel he was witnessing something that would be studied and debated for decades by sports psychologists, journalists, and basketball fans worldwide. Because I discovered something about Michael that not even my own parents knew, Larry said, his voice adopting an almost clinical tone that starkly contrasted with the emotional nature of the revelation. At 16, Michael had a completely unhealthy obsession with losing. Every time he lost something, whether it was a basketball game, a card game, or even a race to the corner, he'd stay up all night practicing in the dark, obsessed with the idea that he had failed. Dan Patrick felt a literal shiver run down his spine as he processed this extraordinary revelation about the teenage psychology of the future greatest basketball player in history. The image Larry had conjured, 16-year-old Michael Jordan, consumed by defeat to the point of solitary practice in the pre-dawn darkness, was simultaneously inspiring and profoundly unsettling. Dan could vividly picture the young Michael in the Jordan backyard, illuminated only by the faint moonlight and streetlights, throwing ball after ball at the hoop as the rest of the world slept, nurturing an obsession that would later become his greatest strength and, perhaps, his greatest weakness. But knowing that Larry had discovered this specific psychological vulnerability and consciously chosen to manipulate it rather than simply supporting it naturally, added a dimension of moral complexity to the story that was almost impossible to fully process. So you saw this obsession and decided to protect him from it by manipulating the outcomes of games between you? Dan asked, desperately trying to understand the teenage logic behind a decision that had shaped one of the greatest careers in sports history. Were you attempting to shield Michael from the psychological pain of continued defeat? Larry slowly shook his head, and for the first time since the interview began, a smile graced his face. Not a smile of joy or nostalgia, but the melancholic, regret-laden smile of someone who had made impossible decisions in extraordinary circumstances and spent the rest of their life questioning whether they had done the right thing. His hands moved across the table as he mentally arranged the words to explain a psychological strategy he had developed as a teenager, a strategy that had irrevocably shaped the destiny of one of the greatest athletic careers in world history. The weight of the responsibility Larry had shouldered at 17 was almost incomprehensible to Dan. The notion that a young man had deliberately assumed total psychological control over his younger brother's competitive development, molding his mentality through calculated and sustained manipulation over months. I realized that if I continued winning and showed him he still had much to learn, it would psychologically destroy him in a way that could never be repaired, Larry explained, his voice gaining strength and clarity as he revealed, for the first time, the meticulous strategy he had devised 5 decades prior. For months on end, I deliberately missed shots I normally would have made without thinking, feigned fatigue when I still had the energy to play for hours, and even simulated minor injuries to give Michael advantages he didn't realize were artificial. All of this was precisely calculated so that he would develop a firm foundation of confidence and genuinely begin to believe he could conquer anyone, in any situation, if he just pushed himself hard enough. Larry's final confession reverberated through the ESPN radio studio like a biblical revelation, completely and irrevocably altering Dan Patrick's understanding of one of the most celebrated and repeated sports narratives in American culture. Every morning game in the Jordans' backyard, each seemingly earned victory by Michael through sheer determination and talent, each moment of burgeoning confidence celebrated for decades as evidence of a prodigy's natural development, all had been painstakingly and deliberately orchestrated by a teenager who had willingly assumed the monumental responsibility of shaping the competitive psychology of a future global legend. Dan felt an overwhelming mixture of awe and horror at the sheer magnitude of what Larry had done. He had essentially artificially constructed the complete psychological foundation that would later allow Michael Jordan to become the utterly ruthless competitor the world knew and revered. So, the inspiration you supposedly gave him through example and fraternal competition, Dan began, his voice visibly faltering as his mind struggled to fully process the enormity of the revelation he had just heard, was entirely fabricated from beginning to end, Dan, Larry concluded, his final words echoing through the studio with the devastating force of a confession suppressed and guarded in absolute secrecy for nearly half a century. I deliberately and consciously artificially created the entire psychological groundwork that enabled him to become the ruthless competitor the world knows today. The studio had transformed into something entirely transcending ordinary sports journalism, becoming a hallowed confessional where decades of family secrets were unearthed with the surgical precision of an archaeologist unearthing priceless artifacts capable of rewriting human history. Dan Patrick felt the crushing weight of history bearing down on his shoulders, like an emotional avalanche, as he meticulously processed the devastating magnitude of the revelations Larry Jordan had shared about the calculated and systematic manipulation of the morning backyard games in the Jordan family home in Wilmington, North Carolina. There was something profoundly unsettling about Larry's facial expression, unequivocally suggesting that the most devastating and psychologically destructive revelations were yet to come. A bottomless abyss of pain, remorse, and corrosive guilt was evident in his brown eyes, hinting at even deeper, darker layers of familial secrets patiently awaiting exposure to the harsh light of journalistic truth. The unforgiving fluorescent lights of the studio cast dramatic, almost theatrical shadows across Larry's deeply lined face, accentuating every wrinkle, every scar, every mark that silently told the epic story of a lifetime burdened by the crushing psychological weight of morally ambiguous decisions made in the vulnerability of adolescence. Decisions whose monumental consequences reverberated relentlessly through decades of global fame, extraordinary athletic success, and public adoration. Larry, one of the most universally recognized and celebrated things about the two of you is that you instilled in Michael the iconic philosophy of never giving up, of always believing in yourself, even when things seemed impossibly hopeless and desperate, said Dan Patrick, his voice imbued with the profoundly respectful, almost reverential tone of someone consciously navigating hallowed ground in the Jordan athletic mythology, a narrative that had inspired millions worldwide. How exactly did you develop this revolutionary philosophy, one so fundamentally central and definitive to Michael's legendary competitive mentality, influencing not only his basketball career, but entire generations of athletes and everyday people seeking inspiration to overcome adversity in their own lives? Dan's seemingly innocent question triggered a physical and emotional reaction in Larry Jordan that was not only visible, but utterly devastating in its raw intensity and human vulnerability. Heavy tears began slowly forming in the corners of his aged brown eyes, not nostalgic tears of fraternal pride or happy reminiscences of golden times, but dense, salty tears of a deeply corrosive and destructive guilt meticulously concealed, locked away in the darkest recesses of his soul for nearly half a century of self-imposed silence. His calloused hands, moments before planted firmly on the polished mahogany table with resolute determination, began uncontrollably trembling again. But this time it wasn't the nervous tremor of anticipated anxiety. It was the physical and emotional tremor of someone about to publicly confess what he considered to be the gravest moral sin, the greatest psychological betrayal, and the most profound emotional manipulation of his entire life. Larry closed his eyes for a moment that felt like a painful eternity, as if spiritually preparing to plunge into even darker, deeper, and more treacherous emotional waters than those he had just courageously navigated. Dan, this is definitely the most difficult, painful, and devastating part of this confession to recount, said Larry Jordan, his voice visibly cracking and trembling, like a leaf in the wind as tears began to flow slowly and inexorably down his lined cheeks. The supposedly inspiring philosophy that everyone believes I taught Michael, that never-give-up mentality that has become legendary in the world of sports. It was born from the biggest, most calculated, and most destructive lie I have ever consciously told in my entire life. The apocalyptic silence that followed Larry's bombshell confession was so profound, dense, and laden with historical significance that Dan Patrick could literally feel the frigid studio air becoming physically heavier and more suffocating, as if the radio waves themselves were vibrating dangerously with the devastating emotional intensity of the confession being simultaneously broadcast to millions of completely unsuspecting listeners across the American territory. The gradual and terrifying realization that America's most universally celebrated, studied, and revered modern sports philosophy, the iconic never-give-up mentality, meticulously analyzed by renowned sports psychologists, quoted in countless inspiring motivational speeches, and internationally hailed as the ultimate example of unyielding human determination, perseverance, and resilience, had been born from a deliberately calculated strategic lie, was almost psychologically impossible to fully process without some form of cognitive breakdown. Dan Patrick felt his stomach violently contract, not only from the profound journalistic shock, but from the growing and terrifying understanding that he was witnessing in real time the systematic and relentless deconstruction of one of the most fundamentally inspiring and culturally significant narratives in contemporary American popular mythology. Larry, when you specifically state that this philosophy was born from a lie, said Dan Patrick, his professional voice carrying a complex blend of genuine journalistic fascination and mounting, uncontrollable horror, are you referring to a specific, identifiable moment in your lives? A particular, concrete situation where you deliberately and consciously lied to Michael about something absolutely fundamental to the development of his competitive spirit and his understanding of himself as an athlete and as a person? Larry Jordan nodded slowly and painfully, and Dan Patrick could see with crystal clarity that the devastated man was preparing mentally and emotionally to reveal the precise moment, the exact, historically significant instant that had not only irrevocably altered the course of Michael Jordan's athletic career, but potentially the entire course of American basketball history and global sports culture. The emotional flashback Larry was about to share with the world seemed to be physically materializing in the charged air between them, as if the solid walls of the modern ESPN radio studio were magically dissolving to reveal the sweaty, emotionally charged locker room of Laney High School in 1979, where vulnerable teenagers in grimy basketball uniforms processed exhilarating triumphs and devastating defeats that would irrevocably shape their adult lives, their personal identities, and their professional destinies. Larry took a deep, controlled breath, like a seasoned diver meticulously preparing for a perilous descent into the most treacherous and unexplored depths of the human emotional ocean. And Dan instinctively knew he was about to hear about the exact moment, the precise instant when the immortal legend of Michael Jordan was artificially and deliberately conceived through a desperate and calculated fraternal lie. The specific moment that changed absolutely everything, that irrevocably altered the course of global basketball history, was when Michael was brutally cut from the Laney High School varsity team, said Larry Jordan, his voice taking on a profoundly hypnotic and cinematic narrative quality that instantly transported Dan Patrick and millions of rap listeners back in time to that fateful, historically significant day in 1979. That afternoon, he arrived home utterly and absolutely emotionally devastated, weeping with a desperate, inconsolable anguish like I had never, ever witnessed in anyone before or since. Michael was literally psychologically shattered, reduced to millions of emotional fragments, repeating like a desperate, self-flagellating mantra, "Larry, they said categorically, I'm not good enough to play for that team. They told me to my face I lack the talent. Maybe they're completely right about me. Maybe I'll never amount to anything in basketball. Maybe I'm truly a complete failure as a player." The devastatingly human image Larry had painted with his words, 16-year-old Michael Jordan, the future undisputed global icon of the sport, weeping inconsolably and desperately in the modest family kitchen after being publicly rejected by the high school team, was simultaneously profoundly humanizing and emotionally devastating for anyone who had grown up admiring Michael Jordan's seemingly invincible psychological fortitude. Dan Patrick could visualize the scene with cinematic detail, the modest, welcoming Jordan home in Wilmington, North Carolina. Larry helplessly watching his younger brother completely unravel emotionally after facing his first major public basketball rejection, the pivotal, historically significant moment where the destiny of one of the greatest sporting careers in human history hung precariously by an extremely fragile emotional thread. But knowing now, through Larry's painful confession, that he had consciously chosen to respond to that extreme human vulnerability with a calculated, manipulative lie instead of offering honest, genuine, and transparent support, added a layer of moral complexity almost impossible to process or adequately assess. Dan felt a crushing mixture of admiration for fraternal love and horror at psychological manipulation upon realizing he was hearing about the precise moment when Michael Jordan's legendary and seemingly innate competitive mentality was artificially and deliberately implanted through systematic psychological manipulation by his own older brother. And it was precisely there, in that moment of utter human vulnerability, that you instilled the philosophy of never giving up. Bakili, Dan Patrick asked, his voice laced with a tense and almost unbearable anticipation of what he was about to hear. Instinctively knowing the answer would fundamentally redefine his understanding of one of the most celebrated narratives in modern sports psychology. Was it in that specific moment of emotional fragility that you planted the psychological seeds of the mindset that would define Michael Jordan for the rest of his legendary career and for all eternity in sports history? Larry Jordan slowly and painfully shook his head, and for the first time since the devastating start of the interview, Dan Patrick saw something in his expression that dangerously approached absolute remorse and corrosive guilt that had consumed his soul. Not just melancholic sadness or painful nostalgia, but the kind of profound, destructive, and eternally corrosive regret that relentlessly devours a person from within over decades of conscious life. His words emerged slowly and agonizingly, as if each syllable were physically agonizing to utter, carrying the crushing weight of a moral decision made in the vulnerability of adolescence, but whose monumental consequences had relentlessly reverberated through a lifetime of global fame, extraordinary success, and international public adoration. Dan could clearly see that Larry was heroically struggling, not just against the overwhelming emotion of the present moment, but against decades of accumulated psychological rationalization and moral justification for an action that he knew, in the deepest and truest depths of his tormented soul, had been fundamentally dishonest and manipulative, even if motivated by the purest and most genuine fraternal love a human being can feel for another. It was precisely there that I deliberately and calculatedly lied to him, Dan, Larry Jordan said, the words escaping his lips like the public confession of an original sin that he had carried alone and in absolute silence for nearly 5 decades of self-imposed psychological torment. I stared directly and coldly into my younger brother's devastated tear-filled eyes and uttered something I knew with absolute mathematical certainty was untrue, something I concocted on the spot to manipulate his psychology. Mike, you are infinitely better than any mediocre guy on that pathetic team. The problem isn't you or your talent, which is obvious and superior. The real problem is that they are mortally afraid of your extraordinary potential. They know that if you are given a single chance to show what you're capable of, you will make them all look like complete amateurs and embarrassments. Larry's devastating confession detonated across the ESPN radio studio like an emotional nuclear bomb, reverberating through the airwaves with a force that felt physically tangible and destructive. Dan Patrick felt the monumental impact of those words not only as a seasoned professional journalist, but as someone who had grown up deeply admiring the classic story of Michael Jordan's perseverance, the quintessential American narrative of a gifted young man unjustly rejected, yet heroically refusing to abandon his dreams, triumphantly proving all his detractors completely wrong about his potential. To discover now, through this devastating public confession, that this universally inspiring narrative had been artificially and deliberately constructed through a strategic fraternal lie was akin to suddenly finding one of the most solid foundations of American sports mythology made entirely of psychological quicksand. Dan could vividly imagine millions of listeners nationwide having their fundamental understandings of determination, perseverance, overcoming adversity, and character completely rewritten and redefined in real time through their radio waves. The stark truth is that Michael wasn't truly prepared or mature enough at that particular moment, Larry Jordan continued, his voice gradually gaining strength and resolve as he finally released decades of accumulated guilt, repressed pain, and self-imposed psychological torment. He was good, yes, very good for his age, but definitely not exceptional yet. Not the supernatural phenomenon he would eventually become through years of obsessive work. The experienced technicians at Laney High School were likely technically correct in their professional assessment at that specific juncture of Michael's adolescence. But I knew with the uncanny and inexplicable intuition of an elder sibling, observing and analyzing, that if Michael genuinely believed he had been unjustly targeted, that he had been a victim of dirty politics or institutional envy, this would ignite an internal flame of competitive vengeance that would never, ever extinguish throughout his entire life. Dan Patrick was struggling heroically to process the absolutely staggering magnitude of what he was hearing in real time. The revolutionary notion that Larry Jordan, at the tender age of 17, had deliberately and ingeniously implanted a complex narrative of persecution and injustice into his younger brother's impressionable mind, transforming a technically legitimate rejection based on current skill into a perceived injustice that would fuel subsequent decades of obsessive and destructive competitiveness. It was a psychological manipulation of almost frightening and disturbing sophistication, especially considering that it had been conceived, planned, and executed by an ordinary teenager during a moment of intense familial emotional crisis. Dan could clearly see the diabolical strategic genius of Larry's carefully constructed lie. By masterfully transforming Michael's personal humiliation into targeted indignation, by redirecting his destructive inner pain into constructive outward rage directed against those who allegedly had criminally underestimated him, Larry had essentially artificially created the pure psychological fuel that would power one of the most dominant, obsessive, and historically significant careers in the history of global sport. I deliberately and strategically planted the psychological seed of the prove them all wrong mentality that defined him forever, Larry Jordan said, his final words echoing through the studio with the devastating force of a confession that had been suppressed and stifled by a lifetime of self-imposed silence. The world's celebrated philosophy of never giving up didn't come from accumulated ancestral wisdom, Dan. It didn't come from life experience or careful observation of human nature. Born from a desperate, strategic falsehood I concocted on the spot, a psychological fabrication crafted specifically to transform his humiliation into enduring competitive fuel. Dan Patrick meticulously observed Larry Jordan discreetly wiping away the heavy tears, still slowly tracing their path down his deeply lined, life-weary face, instinctively knowing he had just witnessed the most devastating, complex, and historically significant confession in modern American sports journalism. But something indefinable in Larry's tense body language, in the way his shoulders remained bowed beneath an unseen weight, unequivocally suggested that deeper, darker layers of psychological torment lay patiently awaiting revelation to the world, a pain that transcended even the calculated and systematic manipulation he had just publicly confessed. The unforgiving fluorescent lights of the studio seemed more intense now, creating a dramatic, almost theatrical contrast between brilliant light and dark shadow on Larry's ravaged face, as if each progressive revelation were literally illuminating hidden, secret aspects of his tormented soul that had remained buried in the deepest darkness for nearly half a century of self-imposed silence. Larry, one of the most universally touching, moving, and celebrated aspects of your extraordinary relationship is that Michael permanently honored you on the first Air Jordan sneaker with the absolutely iconic inscription, "Dear Larry," etched for all eternity, said Dan Patrick, his professional voice carrying an almost religious, solemn reverence as he mentioned one of the most recognized, revered, and culturally significant symbols in the history of sports marketing and global popular culture. Can you tell us in as much detail as possible precisely how you learned of this historic tribute? How did you feel emotionally when you discovered that your younger brother had deliberately immortalized your supposedly inspirational influence in the commercial product that would define your personal brand, your public identity, and your cultural legacy for all eternity in human history? Dan's seemingly innocent question triggered a devastating facial transformation in Larry Jordan that was simultaneously profoundly moving and utterly terrifying to observe in real time. A slow, melancholic smile gradually appeared on his trembling lips, but it was definitely not a radiant smile of genuine fraternal pride or happy nostalgia for cherished family memories. It was the devastatingly sad, bitter, and remorse-filled smile of someone who had received the greatest public honor of their entire life, based on the greatest, most elaborate, and most destructive lie they had ever consciously told another human being. His calloused hands moved nervously and restlessly over the polished table as he prepared mentally and emotionally to relive a specific moment that had been simultaneously the proudest and most painful, traumatic, and psychologically devastating of his earthly existence. A complex memory that perfectly exemplified the labyrinthine moral complexity of his manipulative relationship with Michael Jordan. Larry closed his eyes for a moment that seemed to last an agonizing eternity. And when he opened them again with resolute determination, there was a raw, vulnerable, confessional quality in his gaze that unequivocally suggested he was about to reveal how even the purest, most innocent, and seemingly sacred moments of fraternal love had been irrevocably tainted by the systematic psychological manipulation he had orchestrated decades before. Dan, when Michael showed me that first historical Air Jordan prototype for the first time, holding it in his hands as if it were the holy grail of basketball, I literally almost told him absolutely everything in that very moment, said Larry Jordan, his voice taking on a profoundly hypnotic and cinematic narrative quality that instantly transformed the modern studio into an emotional time machine capable of transporting any listener back to that historical moment. Because I knew with absolute mathematical certainty, with a crystalline clarity that sliced through me like a razor, that this seemingly touching and universally acclaimed tribute was based on a wholly fabricated and deliberately constructed false version of our family history, A romanticized and inspiring narrative I had methodically and meticulously engineered through years of manipulative psychology, strategic lies, and emotional engineering. Larry's devastating confession echoed through the ESPN radio studio like the first ominous thunderclap of an apocalyptic emotional storm poised to utterly obliterate any remaining vestiges of the inspiring, romantic, and universally acclaimed narrative of the Jordan brothers that had inspired millions worldwide. Dan Patrick felt his heart dangerously accelerate as he methodically processed the absolutely staggering implications of those historically charged words. The terrifying possibility that even the most iconic, recognized, and celebrated tribute in the history of global sports marketing had been predicated on a fundamentally flawed, distorted, and artificially constructed understanding of the familial dynamics it so affectionately and reverently celebrated. The devastating mental image of a young, talented, and genuinely grateful Michael Jordan, deliberately deciding to publicly honor his older brother in the commercial product that would define his brand, identity, and legacy for all eternity, now took on a dimension of tragic Shakespearean irony that was almost emotionally unbearable to fully process without some form of psychological breakdown. Dan could vividly imagine Larry at that pivotal moment in 1985, holding the trembling first Air Jordan in his hands, seeing the inscription, "Dear Larry," permanently etched into the leather, knowing with absolute certainty that each individual letter of that tribute was an eternal and inescapable reminder of his own fundamental fraternal dishonesty. It was precisely 1985, and Michael was at the absolute apex of crucial business negotiations that would forever alter the entire landscape of global sports marketing, signing that utterly revolutionary contract with Nike that would establish a completely novel and unprecedented paradigm for lucrative partnerships between elite athletes and multinational brands, Larry continued, his detailed narrative assuming rich cinematic elements that vividly painted the historical scene with intensely emotional colors. He called me directly at home on a sunny Friday afternoon, around 5:30, and I could distinctly hear in his animated voice a genuine and pure emotion I hadn't heard since we were innocent children, carefree playing in our Wilmington backyard. Michael was literally vibrating with uncontrollable exhilaration, an infectious energy that overflowed through the telephone line, as he enthusiastically declared, "Larry, older brother, you just won't believe what I just did here at Nike's offices. I deliberately placed a special and permanent tribute to you on my first official branded sneakers. It says, 'Dear Larry,' right there on the right side, engraved into the leather forever, so that the entire world would eternally know that you unfailingly believed in me when absolutely no one else had faith in my potential. Every person who purchases these sneakers anywhere on the planet will automatically know that I had an exceptional brother who never doubted my talent, even during the darkest and most desperate moments of my adolescence." The emotional words Larry faithfully reproduced from Michael's narrative struck the studio like sharp psychological daggers, each syllable bearing the devastating weight of the tragic irony that defined that specific historical moment in the Jordan family story. Dan Patrick could visualize the scene with perfect cinematic detail. 22-year-old Michael Jordan, seated in the opulent modern Nike office in Beaverton, Oregon, proudly holding the prototype of what would inevitably become one of the most iconic, recognizable, and culturally significant commercial products in world history. Completely oblivious and innocent to the fact that the fraternal tribute he had painstakingly inscribed for eternity celebrated a wholly fictitious, idealized, and artificially constructed version of his elder brother. The crystalline purity of Michael's gratitude, the absolute genuineness of his profound fraternal love, and the moving sincerity of his public homage contrasted brutally with the grim reality that Larry had systematically and calculatingly manipulated every formative experience leading to that specific moment of global public recognition. Dan felt an overwhelming emotional mixture of admiration for Michael's unconditional love and horror at the moral complexity of the situation Larry had deliberately created. A psychological labyrinth where falsehood and affection, manipulation and devotion, deceit and sincerity intertwined in ways that defied any simple moral categorization or conventional ethical judgment. How did you manage to respond emotionally to that phone call, Larry? Dan Patrick inquired, his voice carrying a morbid, almost voyeuristic fascination with the complex psychology of this historical moment. What precisely went through your mind when you heard Michael speaking with such enthusiasm and love about the tribute he had specifically crafted for you? Larry Jordan visibly swallowed, and Dan could clearly observe that he was consciously reliving one of the most emotionally complex, psychologically devastating, and morally contradictory experiences of his entire life. A specific moment where fraternal pride and personal shame, unconditional love and corrosive guilt, public celebration and private torment coexisted simultaneously in a single, devastating instant that would define the remainder of his existence. His weathered hands trembled perceptibly as he braced himself mentally and emotionally to meticulously detail the internal reaction he had meticulously concealed for 4 full decades. The complex emotional response to an homage that should have logically been the proudest, most triumphant moment of his life, but instantly became an inescapable and constant source of self-imposed psychological torment. The devastated expression on his face was precisely that of someone being forced to relive their own emotional crucifixion in slow motion, acutely aware that each publicly uttered word would add more crushing weight to the guilt he had carried entirely alone for so long. I felt utterly and completely emotionally devastated, Dan, Larry Jordan said, his voice visibly cracking with raw emotion that had been suppressed, suffocated, and kept secret for 4 full decades of self-imposed silence. Because in that specific moment, I perceived with crystal clarity that Michael was publicly honoring me for something I had systematically manipulated from the outset. He genuinely and sincerely believed that I had always possessed a natural and spontaneous faith in him, that my belief in his extraordinary potential was organic, intuitive, and spontaneous, when in fact I had artificially and calculatingly constructed that faith through years of strategic lies and systematic psychological manipulation. Larry's devastating confession revealed a dimension of psychological suffering almost impossible to fully comprehend without personal experience. The existential agony of being publicly honored for virtues you know with absolute certainty you do not possess, of having your love and dedication celebrated worldwide when you know they were expressed through fundamentally dishonest and morally questionable methods. Dan Patrick could imagine Larry, in the years to come, observing the Air Jordan become a global cultural phenomenon, seeing Dear Larry on millions of feet around the world, each casual sighting serving as a constant public reminder of his own fraternal duplicity and fundamental dishonesty. It was a form of self-imposed psychological torture few humans could endure, a constant and utterly inescapable reminder that his most positive influence on his brother's life had been built on foundations of carefully constructed lies and systematic emotional manipulation. For all those subsequent years, every time I saw that iconic sneaker on the streets of any American city, every time I saw the phrase, Dear Larry in television commercials or specialized sports magazines, every time I heard sports commentators speak respectfully about the inspiring influence I supposedly had exerted on Michael, Larry continued, his voice gradually gaining strength as he finally verbalized decades of inner torment. I was painfully reminded that Michael was honoring a completely fabricated version of his brother. He was publicly honoring the Larry he believed existed, the naturally wise, instinctively motivating, and genuinely inspiring brother, not the Larry who actually existed, the psychological manipulator who had systematically orchestrated every formative experience of his adolescence. The anticipation in the studio was palpable, as if the very air itself held its breath, awaiting the unveiling of how the psychological manipulation Larry had orchestrated decades prior had found expression in one of the most surprising and misunderstood moments of Michael Jordan's career. Dan knew instinctively that he was about to hear how even the seemingly innocuous choice of a jersey number had been influenced by the emotional engineering Larry had implemented in his brother's mind when they were just vulnerable adolescents. The moral complexity of the situation was becoming almost unbearable. The notion that Michael Jordan's ostensibly autonomous decisions were, in reality, echoes of psychological manipulations planted decades earlier by someone who loved him so deeply that he was willing to sacrifice his own peace of mind to shape his brother's destiny. He said with moving sincerity and genuine gratitude that cut me like a knife, "Larry, my older brother and my lifelong hero, I deliberately chose the number 45 because you were always my absolute hero, my example of strength and perseverance." Larry continued, reproducing Michael's words with a painful precision that suggested he had replayed that conversation in his mind countless times over the years. "You taught me from a young age that what matters in life isn't never falling, because everyone falls at some point, but always having the courage and determination to get back up, no matter how many times you're knocked down. That lesson you gave me became the bedrock of everything I am as a person and as a competitor." I literally almost crumbled emotionally upon hearing those words come from his mouth, because at that moment I realized with terrifying clarity that even this seemingly simple decision to choose a jersey number was being influenced by the psychological manipulation I had implanted in his impressionable mind decades before. The faithful reproduction of Michael's words fell upon the studio like a revelation that completely redefined Dan Patrick's understanding of the extent of the influence Larry had exerted over his brother. The purity of Michael's gratitude expressed in his own words contrasted brutally with the reality that this gratitude was directed toward lessons that had been artificially implanted through systematic manipulation. Dan could vividly picture the scene. Michael Jordan, at the zenith of one of the most astonishing career transitions in sports history, calling his older brother to elucidate how a seemingly simple uniform number choice was, in actuality, a tribute to teachings he believed he'd received naturally, but which were deliberately constructed through psychological engineering. The irony was staggering. Even in baseball, a completely different sport where Michael was attempting to prove his athletic versatility, he was carrying the echoes of the manipulations Larry had orchestrated in the family backyard in Wilmington. The emotional complexity of the situation was becoming almost impossible to process. Larry had crafted a psychological prison so flawless that his brother couldn't escape it even by switching sports entirely. "Why exactly was this so emotionally painful for you, Larry?" Dan Patrick asked, his voice carrying a blend of journalistic fascination and genuine human concern for the torment he was witnessing unfold before him. What was it about Michael's explanation of the number 45 that elicited such an intense reaction from you? How did this specific conversation relate to everything you told me about the psychological manipulation you orchestrated during your adolescence? Larry inhaled deeply, like a diver preparing to descend into the most dangerous depths of the emotional ocean, and Dan could see that he was steeling himself to reveal an even more disturbing dimension of how his manipulation had shaped not only Michael's career, but his own fundamental identity as a human being. The expression on Larry's face was that of someone contemplating a monster he had inadvertently created, a psychological creature that had grown far beyond anything he had ever intended to bring into existence. His ensuing words would reveal how Michael Jordan's legendary obsession with winning, his famous inability to accept defeat, and his compulsive need to constantly prove himself were not natural characteristics of his personality, but symptoms of a psychological programming that had been implanted when he was vulnerable and impressionable. The realization that Larry was on the cusp of confessing was terrifying. He had effectively ensnared his brother, a prisoner within the confines of his own mind, a mind that had been artificially engineered to preclude any semblance of true peace or fulfillment. Because at that specific juncture, I grasped with crystalline, harrowing clarity that Michael had, quite literally, constructed his entire fundamental identity as a human being upon the bedrock of lessons and precepts I had entirely fabricated and artificially implanted within his psyche, Larry stated, his voice gaining intensity as he finally articulated a perception that had haunted him for decades. His player's mentality, that legendary and seemingly innate obsession with victory that the entire world admired. The infamous inability to accept any form of defeat that had become his hallmark. Absolutely all of it I had deliberately cultivated within him through years of systematic, calculated psychological manipulation. When he chose the number 45, it wasn't merely a touching homage to the older brother who had naturally inspired him. It was a tribute to the complete psychological system, the mental program I had artificially crafted and implanted into his consciousness when he was vulnerable and impressionable. Larry's confession unveiled a dimension of culpability that transcended any ordinary remorse over lies or manipulation. It was the existential guilt of one who had come to the devastating understanding that he had transformed another human being into an artificial facsimile of himself. Dan Patrick struggled to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. The possibility that Michael Jordan, the most celebrated competitor in the history of sport, was not naturally obsessive or incapable of accepting defeat, but had been psychologically programmed to be so through the machinations of his own brother. The irony was devastating. Larry had loved Michael so profoundly that he had effectively extinguished his natural capacity to find peace or contentment, turning him into a competitive machine that could never rest because it had been programmed to interpret any rest as weakness. The choice of the number 45 in baseball was not merely a tribute. It was irrefutable evidence that Michael had become a prisoner of a mindset that wasn't even truly his own, but had been implanted by someone who believed he was helping him achieve greatness. Michael had become a psychological prisoner of the very mindset I had artificially constructed for him, Larry continued, his words laden with the weight of a realization that had haunted him for years. Every time I saw him on television during his baseball career, desperately striving to prove he could succeed in any sport, I knew he wasn't truly pursuing a genuine passion for baseball or naturally exploring his athletic versatility. He was running, frantically fleeing something I had created within his mind. This compulsive, relentless need to constantly prove himself, this inability to accept that he was perhaps human and fallible like anyone else. Throughout his baseball career, I watched with growing horror, knowing he was attempting to escape a mental prison I had built with my own hands when we were just children in Wilmington. Dan Patrick was struggling to grasp the psychological magnitude of what Larry was describing. The notion that Michael Jordan's baseball career, viewed by the world as a courageous display of athletic versatility and determination, was, in reality, a desperate attempt to escape a psychological programming implanted by his own brother. The image of Michael Jordan, the greatest competitor in basketball history, frantically attempting to prove himself in an entirely different sport, not because he wanted to, but because he had been psychologically programmed to never accept limitations, was simultaneously tragic and terrifying. Dan could envision Larry watching Michael's baseball games on television, knowing that each frustrated swing, each error in the field, each moment of struggle was evidence of how his manipulation had transcended the sport and become a destructive force in his brother's life. The guilt Larry must have felt was almost unimaginable. To watch someone you love battling demons you yourself had implanted in their mind. The constant pressure he felt, that relentless obsession the world admired as heroic determination, the psychological need to prove something all the time that became his signature. Absolutely none of that was natural to him, Dan, Larry said, his voice now carrying a desperate conviction, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his interviewer. This intricate psychological scaffolding, this mental programming that forged him into the most formidable competitor in sports history, was something I deliberately instilled in his mind when he was merely a vulnerable, impressionable teenager who placed absolute trust in me. The Michael Jordan the world knows and venerates, that ruthlessly competitive machine that never accepts defeat, that transmutes every setback into motivation, that finds impossible ways to triumph when all others deem it impossible. That Michael was my creation, a product of my psychological manipulation, not a natural expression of who he truly was as a person. Larry's ultimate confession reverberated through the studio, a revelation that utterly redefined not only the history of the Jordan brothers, but potentially the very nature of how the world comprehends greatness, resolve, and human excellence. Dan Patrick was confronting the harrowing possibility that the greatest individual career in sports history had been constructed upon artificial, psychological foundations, that the world's most admired competitor was, in a sense, an artificial construct of well-intentioned, yet fundamentally dishonest fraternal manipulation. The ultimate irony was devastating. Larry had loved Michael so profoundly that he had effectively robbed him of the possibility of discovering who he truly was as a person, transforming him into an artificial version of himself who could never find genuine peace because he had been programmed to interpret peace as weakness. The number 45 on the baseball uniform was not merely a tribute. It was a symbol of how Larry's manipulation had transcended sport and become a defining force in Michael Jordan's fundamental identity as a human being. To this day, Dan, when I watch documentaries about his career or hear people talk about his natural obsession with winning, Larry concluded, his final words laden with decades of guilt and regret, I know they are admiring something I artificially created, not something that was naturally within him waiting to be discovered. Decades of familial secrets had been methodically laid bare, with an intensity that left both Dan Patrick and millions of listeners across the nation utterly absorbed in the most extraordinary narrative ever recounted on American radio. The air inside the studio crackled with the emotional electricity of revelations that had fundamentally redefined the understanding of one of the most celebrated sports narratives in history, and Dan could physically feel the weight of journalistic responsibility pressing upon his shoulders as he contemplated how to appropriately conclude an interview that had transcended all expectations and ventured into deeply disturbing psychological territory. Larry Jordan sat across the table, visibly depleted by the emotional catharsis of publicly confessing secrets he had borne alone for nearly half a century, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped away the tears that continued to stream down his weathered face. The atmosphere in the studio had undergone a complete metamorphosis since the interview's commencement. What had begun as a routine promotional conversation about a charity event had morphed into the systematic deconstruction of one of American culture's most inspiring narratives, unveiling layers of moral complexity that defied any simplistic categorization of right and wrong. Dan knew instinctively that he was witnessing something historically significant, a moment that would be studied and debated for decades by psychologists, journalists, and sports fans across the globe. Larry, after absolutely everything you've revealed here today, after sharing secrets you've kept for nearly half a century, after showing us a completely different dimension of the story we all thought we knew, Dan Patrick said, his voice conveying a mixture of reverence for what he had witnessed and anticipation for what might come next. What exactly would you like to say directly to Michael if you had the opportunity? If you could speak to him now, knowing that he will hear this interview, knowing that the entire world will hear what you have to say, what would be your final words to the brother whose life you admit to having shaped in ways that no one ever imagined? Dan's question unleashed an emotional reaction in Larry Jordan that was simultaneously devastating and cathartic to observe, as if all the decades of suppressed guilt, brotherly love, and regret had finally found an escape valve through which they could be released to the world. Fresh tears began to stream down his face as he struggled to find the appropriate words to articulate feelings that had remained inarticulable for a lifetime. Emotions so intricate and contradictory that they defied any attempt at simple verbalization. His hands moved nervously across the table as he steeled himself for what he knew would be the most pivotal part of the entire interview. The moment he could finally address directly the brother he had loved so intensely that he was willing to sacrifice his own moral integrity to shape his destiny. The expression on his face was that of a man about to confess not only to the world, but to the most important person in his life, knowing that his forthcoming words could forever redefine the most significant relationship he had ever held. Dan could feel the tension in the studio reach an emotional crescendo as Larry prepared to speak directly to Michael over the airwaves, transforming a public confession into an intimate conversation between brothers that would unfold before millions of witnesses. Dan, for 46 consecutive years, I have silently borne the crushing guilt of having deliberately manipulated my younger brother's fundamental psychology, of having commandeered his emotional and competitive development in ways he never knew, Larry said, his voice cracking with emotion as he finally verbalized decades of internal torment. Every title Michael won, every impossible record he broke, every absolutely impossible and magical moment he created on the basketball courts around the world, I knew with absolute certainty that a significant part of me was present in each of those moments. Not the raw talent. That was a natural gift that was 100% his, something neither I nor anyone else could have artificially crafted. But the relentless mindset, the competitive obsession that became his hallmark, the inability to accept defeat that defined him as a competitor. That I meticulously constructed over years of strategic mendacity, psychological manipulation, and emotional engineering, which I implanted within his mind when he was vulnerable and placed his unreserved trust in me. Larry's words reverberated through the studio with the force of a final confession, bearing the weight of decades of guilt now being unleashed upon the world. Dan Patrick could palpably feel the emotional magnitude of the moment, a man finally confronting the public consequences of choices he had made in his adolescence, yet whose effects had echoed throughout one of the most extraordinary careers in sports history. Larry's brutal honesty about his own culpability was juxtaposed with his genuine admiration for Michael's innate talent, creating a complex dynamic where manipulation and love, deception and devotion coexisted in ways that defied simple moral judgment. Dan knew he was witnessing something exceedingly rare, a moment of absolute human vulnerability being broadcast to millions, where someone was willing to dismantle their own reputation to finally be forthright about the complexities of a relationship that had shaped the annals of sports. The studio's atmosphere crackled with anticipation for what was to come, knowing that Larry was preparing to do something that could irrevocably alter his relationship with Michael. "Do you want to speak to him directly now, Larry?" Dan Patrick inquired, his voice laced with a blend of journalistic anticipation and genuine human concern for what was about to transpire. "Are you prepared to have this conversation with Michael live, knowing that millions will be listening to every word, knowing this could forever change the dynamic between the two of you? This is a singular opportunity for you to address this directly, without intermediaries, without filters, just two brothers finally being completely honest with each other after decades of secrets." Larry nodded slowly, a resolve emanating from some deep recess of his soul, as if he had finally mustered the courage to face the most consequential conversation of his life. His hands stilled, anchoring themselves on the table, a physical transformation that mirrored an irreversible emotional resolution forged over decades of unconscious preparation for this very instant. Dan could perceive that Larry had traversed a psychological Rubicon, a point of no return. He had resolved that the time had come to confront the ramifications of his actions, irrespective of the ensuing outcomes. The visage etched upon his face was that of a man who had, at long last, reconciled himself with a decision he knew to be imperative, even if potentially cataclysmic. The studio seemed to have grown eerily silent, as if even the electronic equipment was holding its breath in respectful anticipation of what was about to transpire. Dan knew he was on the precipice of facilitating one of the most consequential conversations in the annals of American radio, a moment where decades of familial secrets would be laid bare in a candid exchange between two of the most significant figures in American sports culture. "Michael deserves the unvarnished truth, unfiltered and unadulterated," Larry stated with a conviction that startled Dan with its resoluteness. "He needs to comprehend that it wasn't merely his extraordinary God-given talent that propelled him to greatness, though that was, of course, fundamental and irreplaceable. It was also having a brother who loved him profoundly and unconditionally enough to lie to him when he believed it necessary, to manipulate his psychology when he thought it would shield him, to sacrifice my own moral integrity when I believed it would help him attain his utmost potential. Michael has the right to know that behind every moment of greatness he achieved, there was someone who had deliberately molded the psychological circumstances that made that greatness possible." Dan Patrick felt his heart quicken as he prepared to initiate the call that would forever alter the history of the Jordan family. His years of experience in television and radio had honed his ability to recognize truly historic moments, and he knew instinctively that he was about to facilitate a conversation that would be remembered and dissected for decades to come. With slightly trembling hands, he retrieved his cell phone and dialed the number he had procured earlier through production contacts, cognizant that each ring would be an eternity of anticipation for Larry, who was about to embark on the most significant conversation of his life. The studio was steeped in absolute silence as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each sound reverberating through the speakers like drum beats heralding a momentous occasion. Larry's eyes fluttered shut, and he drew a deep breath, reminiscent of a soldier steeling himself for the defining battle of his life, cognizant that in mere seconds he would be addressing the very person whose destiny he had shaped through decades of well-intentioned yet fundamentally disingenuous manipulation. "Hello, Larry," came Michael Jordan's familiar voice through the studio speakers, laced with a blend of curiosity and mild concern that instantly transmuted the room's atmosphere. "Dan texted me a few minutes ago, saying you were dropping a bombshell on his show. What exactly is going on over there? What are you two even talking about?" Michael's voice reverberated through the studio like a phantom from the past materializing in the present, bearing with it decades of familial history and instantaneously transforming Larry's public confession into an intimate fraternal dialogue, unfolding before an audience of millions of unseen witnesses. Larry opened his eyes and stared directly at the phone, as if he could see Michael through the connection, his expression revealing a complex tapestry of brotherly affection, profound guilt, and a resolute determination to finally be entirely candid with the most significant person in his life. Dan could feel the emotional electricity in the air as two of the most towering figures in American sports culture prepared to engage in a conversation that would redefine not only their personal relationship, but potentially the public's understanding of one of the most celebrated careers in sports history. The simplicity of Michael's question starkly contrasted with the complexity of the revelations Larry was poised to share, creating an almost unbearable tension in the studio as everyone waited to see how Larry would choose to begin the most difficult conversation of his life. "Mike, are you listening to the show right now?" Larry asked, his voice laden with a vulnerability that Dan had never heard before, as if he were addressing a child on the precipice of discovering that Santa Claus was not in fact real. "Did you catch any of what we were discussing here in the studio? Do you have any inkling of what I've been divulging about our family, about our childhood, about the things that transpired between us when we were young?" Michael chuckled softly, a sound laden with decades of fraternal affection and unshakable trust, utterly oblivious to the seismic shift about to redefine his fundamental understanding of himself and his relationship with Larry. "I'm all ears, Larry, but I just tuned in a few seconds ago. What exactly are you talking about? You sound different. Your voice is strained, like you've been crying. Are you all right? Dan, what's going on over there?" The innocence in Michael's voice contrasted brutally with the gravity of the revelations Larry had shared, creating a moment of tragic irony that was almost emotionally unbearable. Dan could see Larry battling waves of emotion as he steeled himself to dismantle the version of family history Michael had carried throughout his life, knowing that his next words would forever alter how his younger brother viewed not only their childhood, but his very identity as a competitor and as a person. The absolute trust in Michael's voice, his genuine concern for Larry's well-being, his complete ignorance of what he was about to discover, it all created an atmosphere of emotional tension that was almost palpable. Larry took a deep breath, like a diver preparing for the deepest plunge of his life, knowing that when he surfaced, nothing would be the same. "Mike, for years I've kept a secret about us, about our childhood, about how you became the player and competitor you are today," Larry said, his voice gaining strength and resolve as he finally began to unveil the truth he had concealed for a lifetime. "Everything you believe about how you developed as an athlete, about how you discovered your competitive mindset, about how you learned to never give up. Well, I deliberately manipulated much of that when you were young and vulnerable. I orchestrated situations, created circumstances, and implanted ideas in your mind because I saw you had a special talent, but also a fragile psychology that needed to be carefully molded. I did all of this because I loved you more than anything in the world and wanted to shield you from being undone by your own vulnerabilities." The ensuing silence was so profound and laden with significance that Dan Patrick could literally hear his own heart hammering. Seconds that stretched into an eternity ticked by as Michael processed the enormity of what he had just heard, his mind grappling to comprehend how the very bedrock of his identity had just been systematically dismantled by someone he trusted above all others. Dan could envision Michael on the other end of the line, struggling to reconcile the image he held of Larry as a natural mentor and spontaneous inspiration with the reality that he had been systematically manipulated by someone who had meticulously orchestrated every formative experience of his adolescence. The tension in the studio was so thick it felt physically tangible, as if the very air were charged with the electricity of decades of family secrets finally being exposed to the harsh light of truth. "Larry! Brother!" Michael's voice finally crackled through the speakers, carrying a complex admixture of bewilderment, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. "What exactly do you mean by manipulated? Are you telling me you deliberately did things to influence how I thought about myself? Are you saying it wasn't natural, that it wasn't organic? Explain it to me, because I need to understand what you're revealing here." Larry closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself to itemize the manipulations he had orchestrated, knowing that each example he gave would be like a dagger in the heart of someone who had built their entire identity on experiences they had thought were genuine. When he opened his eyes again, there was an iron resolve in his expression, as if he had finally found the strength to face the full consequences of his adolescent actions. Dan could see that Larry had decided to spare no detail, to not minimize his culpability, to not try to soften the impact of his revelations. He was determined to be utterly honest, no matter how agonizing it might be for both brothers. The courage he displayed in that moment was almost as awe-inspiring as the manipulation he was confessing, demonstrating that the fraternal love that had motivated his actions decades prior was still present, now manifested through a brutal honesty that few human beings would possess the fortitude to demonstrate. "The defeats that motivated you throughout your career, Mike, specifically that high school team rejection, you've always cited as your defining moment of inspiration," Larry said, his voice now firm and clear as he systematically detailed his manipulations. "The never-give-up philosophy that became your trademark and inspired millions of people around the world. The fundamental belief that you were wronged and needed to prove everyone wrong about your potential. Much of that I artificially and deliberately created because I realized you had extraordinary talent, but also an exceedingly fragile psychology that could be easily destroyed if not carefully protected and molded. I did all of this because I loved you deeply and saw in you a potential that even you yourself didn't yet recognize. But I knew that potential could only be realized if I crafted the right psychological conditions for you to flourish." Michael was silent for several seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice was laden with an emotion that was simultaneously devastating and profoundly touching to hear. "Larry, my older brother, are you telling me you spent 46 entire years carrying this knowledge alone? Are you revealing that you sacrificed your own peace of mind, your own moral integrity, to mold my psychology in a way that would allow me to reach my full potential? You did all of this for me and never uttered a word, never sought recognition, never attempted to benefit in any way." Michael's emotional response stunned both Larry and Dan Patrick, who had anticipated anger, betrayal, or at least prolonged confusion, but instead were hearing something that sounded like deep gratitude mingled with admiration and intensified fraternal love. The transformation in Michael's voice was almost instantaneous, from initial bewilderment to an understanding that transcended the specific manipulation and focused on the love that had motivated every action of Larry's. Dan could sense that the conversation was taking a completely unexpected turn, where the revelation of manipulation was being recontextualized not as betrayal, but as the greatest act of fraternal love in history. Michael's reaction was redefining the entire narrative in real time, transforming a confession of guilt into a celebration of familial devotion that transcended any conventional moral judgment about honesty and manipulation. "I didn't want you to doubt your extraordinary achievements, Mike," Larry said, his voice cracking again with emotion. "I didn't want you to question whether your success was legitimate, whether your victories were deserved, whether your greatness was real. Everything I did was to create the psychological conditions that allowed your natural talent to fully manifest, but the talent itself, the execution, the dedication, the hard work, that was all 100% you." Michael took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a conviction and emotional maturity that completely transformed the atmosphere of the conversation. Larry, listen closely and pay rapt attention because I need you to grasp something fundamental, Michael said, his voice assuming the authoritative timbre he'd employed to lead teams to 6 NBA championships. It matters absolutely nothing how the motivation initially took root. It doesn't matter if you planted those ideas in my head when I was young and impressionable. It doesn't matter if you manipulated situations or engineered artificial circumstances. You did all of it out of pure, genuine love, out of a desire to protect me and help me reach my utmost potential. And I've become who I am today, not merely because of the talent God gave me, but because I had a brother who cared enough to safeguard my mind and shape my psychology when I was vulnerable and needed guidance. Michael's response continued with an eloquence and emotional depth that left both Larry and Dan utterly astounded. Larry, thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for loving me enough to shoulder that psychological burden alone for so many long years. Thank you for sacrificing your own mental tranquility to create the Michael Jordan the world knows and admires. And thank you for finally trusting me enough, for respecting me enough as a grown man, to tell me the complete truth about what you did for me. It diminishes my accomplishments not at all, brother. In fact, it showcases exactly the extraordinary kind of family that raised us, the kind of unconditional love that has always existed between us. Larry was openly weeping now, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than guilt and remorse. Mike, you're not angry with me. You don't feel betrayed or manipulated. You don't question your own achievements knowing I interfered with your psychological development. Michael's final response echoed through the studio with the force of a declaration that completely redefined the narrative of manipulation into a story of extraordinary brotherly love. Angry? Larry, I'm proud. Proud to have a brother who sacrificed his own peace of mind to mold me into the man I've become. Proud to have someone who loved me so much he was willing to carry secrets for decades to protect my confidence. This doesn't diminish my accomplishments. It illustrates that behind the most storied basketball career in history stood a brother whose love was such that he would do anything, even sacrifice his own integrity, to help me achieve greatness. It's the most beautiful story of familial love I've ever heard, and I am blessed to be a part of it. 3 days after the interview that irrevocably altered the Jordan family's narrative, Larry's phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. It was Michael. Larry, are you awake? I need you here at the house. Michael's voice held an urgency Larry hadn't heard since childhood. Without hesitation, Larry dressed quickly and hit the empty Chicago roads. 40 minutes later, Larry was navigating the tree-lined avenues of exclusive Highland Park, finally arriving at Michael Jordan's imposing mansion. The gates swung open automatically, as if anticipating his arrival. There were no paparazzi, no cameras, just two brothers who needed to converse with their hands and their hearts. Michael was waiting in the backyard, cradling a worn basketball. It was the very same ball they had used decades ago in Wilmington. The leather was cracked with age, yet it still held the magic of 1,000 youthful mornings. His hands, which had once held 6 NBA championship trophies, now trembled slightly as he bounced the ball on the asphalt. Mike, what are we doing here? Larry asked, bewildered. Finishing what we started 45 years ago, Michael replied, his eyes glistening under the golden morning light. But this time without lies, without manipulation, just the two of us. They began to play in silence, each movement laden with decades of history. Larry, at 63, could still sink a few shots. Michael, even at 62, still possessed that innate elegance that made him a legend. But something was profoundly different this time. With every play by Larry, Michael deliberately created openings. With every shot, Michael feigned defense with less intensity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Larry immediately recognized what was happening. The same delicate dance he had orchestrated decades prior. Michael was doing exactly what Larry had done in the Wilmington backyard. He was letting his brother win out of love. As Larry tallied the final point, sinking a shot that Michael could have effortlessly blocked, the two froze. The morning stillness of Chicago was rent only by the sound of their ragged breaths. Why did you do that? Larry asked, tears coursing unbidden down his face. Michael stepped closer, placing his hands on his older brother's shoulders and smiling through his own tears. Because now I fully understand, Michael said, his voice cracking. "I understand what it is to love someone so profoundly that you're willing to lie to protect them. I understand what it is to bear a burden alone so the one you love can soar free." The two brothers embraced in the center of the court, weeping unrestrainedly as they hadn't since childhood. 45 years of secrets, guilt, and unconditional love were released in that embrace that stretched into an eternity. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes lying for love is the greatest truth there is," Michael whispered into Larry's ear. "Thank you for teaching me that true love always finds a way to forgive," Larry replied, feeling decades of guilt dissolve. As they separated, Michael retrieved the worn ball and ceremoniously presented it to Larry. "This time, it was your turn to truly win." But Larry knew that, in reality, they both had won. They had triumphed over time, guilt, and secrets. They had won together, as it was always meant to be. The Chicago morning sun illuminated the two brothers walking side by side towards home, leaving the court empty, yet brimming with redemption and everlasting love. If the odyssey of Michael Jordan and Larry Jordan resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and delve into the next compelling narrative we've curated for your viewing pleasure. Until then, and before you depart, please share your location in the comments and let me know. What were your thoughts on the denouement of this tale? "Larry, when you specifically state that this philosophy was born from a lie," said Dan Patrick, his professional voice carrying a complex blend of genuine journalistic fascination and mounting, uncontrollable horror. "Are you referring to a specific, identifiable moment in your lives? A particular, concrete situation where you deliberately and consciously lied to Michael about something absolutely fundamental to the development of his competitive spirit and his understanding of himself as an athlete and as a person?"